wanted to take a look at a couple of things from a historical perspective that most of us aren't aware of. We hear things, and at the same time, we don't have a historical context or the proper historical context to get a value or put a value on what it is that's happening. And more importantly, as Allah knows best, why it's happened, okay? So the political reality that we look at now as far as American society is concerned, evangelical Christians are practically 100% for Donald Trump, even though he's not an evangelical Christian by any stretch of the imagination. Some would argue that he's not Christian, period, in light of the fact that. So the question becomes, in context, how is it, what happened, what transpired in America for some of us during our younger years that we weren't aware of, that ends up with this circumstance of evangelical Christians, as they're called, being Republican. Here, not so much. I'll deal with the aspect about Trump, but here, being Republican. What happened? What was this circumstance that took place? And how did it come about? What did they use? Who were the individuals that became involved in it at the forefront? And what were the policies and the procedures that ended up with this Christian sect, if we can say that, called evangelicals? Okay, so basically, in one sense, we have to go back to the 17th century in America and the establishment of the Massachusetts Bay Colony under the Puritan leadership of John Winthrop. And the Puritans are, by the day's terms, they could be called evangelicals, although they're at the root base of the belief of what are known as Presbyterians. But the Massachusetts Bay Colony considered itself special. Special and how? The church fathers for the Puritans, notice I didn't say pilgrims, I'll explain that in a minute. For the Puritans, firmly believe that by the virtue of the fact that they had been able to escape religious persecution in England and the Anglican Church and get to the New World, that they were decreed to build God's kingdom on earth. And God's kingdom on earth would be the Massachusetts Bay Colony. So this dichotomy existed, that the Puritans came to the New World, as it was called, trying to escape and to get away from religious persecution. But yet and still, in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, no other religion, no other Christian sect could be practiced except Puritanism. The idea about the pilgrims, sometimes people exchange Puritans and pilgrims, one for the other, and that shouldn't be done. The pilgrims actually arrive in what becomes the Massachusetts Bay Colony first. And the pilgrims were recognized as being separatists. The Puritans had decided that they would try their best to live with what became known as the Church of England. In today's terms, the Church of England, Anglican, also Episcopalians, one and the same. But the Pilgrims looked at even the Church of England as being so much akin to the Catholic Church and papism, as they called it, that they wanted to be separated from it totally. And the physical separation that they took was to cross the Atlantic and settle in what will become the Massachusetts Bay Colony. The Puritans will come later because there's going to be a problem in England. And to go back a little bit further, one of the most brutal civil wars ever fought on this planet was the one that took place in England between the Royalists and the Protestants, or between the Royalists, the supporters of King James at the time, and the Parliament about control of England. But it was done around religious circumstances, around religious aspects. The Royalists were by and large Catholic and some Anglicans. The Protestants were the Puritans and those involved in the Church of England as such. But to show you why the Pilgrims disliked the Church of England, because it resembled too much of a Catholic church. I was Catholic before I became Muslim. And while I was in while I was in the military, while I was in Okinawa, and so one Sunday morning, my roommate and I, who was from Dallas, Texas, Howard Doty, African American, but also Catholic, decided that we would go to Mass. And we did. It wasn't until the very end of the service that we realized we were not in a Catholic Mass, but in an Episcopalian church service. That's just how close it resembles, okay? So the Pilgrims looking at this, the establishment of the Church of England by Henry VIII, were like, nothing really has changed too much. So they sought separation, okay? Of course, the establishment of the Church of England figures right in with the Reformation, but there's a civil war that takes place in England around religious terms. Ultimately, Parliament wins. It comes out, the Protestant or Protestant, as it's called, military effort comes under the control of an individual who establishes himself, Oliver Cromwell, who establishes himself as military protector of all England, and he shuts Parliament down. So there's again another problem. So ultimately, England ends up with what is called a religious, just bear with me for a minute, a constitutional monarchy, which is what it still claims today. And this comes about in 1688. It's called the Glorious Revolution, where a descendant of the former king, Queen Anne, is in Holland, and she marries William of Orange. Representatives from Parliament approach her and William of Orange and say, basically, we'll invite you to be king and queen of England as long as you do not try to override the authority and the power of the Parliament. And they agree. And this established what is called a constitutional monarchy there. But the Puritans don't like it, so they leave, and they come to the Massachusetts Bay Colony and basically set up a dictatorship, so to speak, because if you try to practice any other Christian belief, as it happened in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, you would be hanged. There was no circumstance here where you could be a Quaker or what ultimately become Baptist or have some disagreement with the church fathers and practice that within the Massachusetts Bay Colony without putting your life in danger. As what happened with a woman by the name of Mary Dwyer, who tried to practice being a Quaker in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and they hanged her for doing so. Roger Williams, the founder of Rhode Island, was a Puritan minister, but when he began to object about the treatment of Native Americans and how their land was being taken, he was persona non grata too, and he left. He used his influence back in England to get a charter from the King of England at the time to establish what becomes Rhode Island. Okay, so there's this long history here of the Protestantization of Christianity in different ways. Pennsylvania and New Jersey, just to cover the base. William Penn gets a charter from King Charles II to establish a colony here. He's given a land grant. William Penn was a Quaker, and Quakers in England were viciously persecuted, beaten, sometimes killed. And so William Penn's father was one of the top admirals in the Admiralty. We would say the Department of the Navy. His father was one of the top admirals. And so King Charles II owed him money. William Penn's father was afraid for his safety. So he went to the king and said, look, you can wipe out the debt that you owe me by giving me a land grant that will allow my son to go to the New World, i.e. North America, and establish a colony. And the king agreed, because in his mind, giving him the charter, which would not preclude the success, it wasn't costing him anything, it wasn't costing Parliament anything, it was going to be given to his son, and they would either make it or break it, but his debt would be wiped out. So William Penn was given the charter. The charter that he was given included all of present-day Pennsylvania and New Jersey. All of present-day Pennsylvania and New Jersey. And William Penn comes in and says, in aspects of religious freedom, anyone can come and settle. Anyone in Pennsylvania, as long as they do not try to enforce their religious beliefs upon everybody else or anyone else. And people come to Philadelphia to settle. You know, out of Germany, you get Lutherans, and any number of individuals that come. And Penn keeps to his word. There's total religious freedom within Pennsylvania. The Massachusetts Bay Colony is looking at what's going on in Pennsylvania and saying, these people are on their way to hell in a rowboat, and they're rowing extremely fast because they firmly believed that their job was to establish God's kingdom on earth. During the course of the time in America, other religious sects come into existence. Baptists, Methodists, and others. One thing about the Baptists and the Methodists, and you have some outstanding orators like, Cotton Mather. You're talking about individuals who were very charismatic, and the sermons that they would give would scare people half to death. Cotton Mather's sermon, about, living in the presence of an angry God and what was going to be the end result of people who disobeyed God and so forth and so on. And so very quickly in not the Anglican Church, but in Baptist, Methodist, and these other sects that grow up, you get this aspect about the charismatic itinerant preacher. If you were to be a minister in the Anglican Church, you went to college for it. You went to learn what that meant. So Harvard, when it was first established, was Harvard Bible College. Later on down the road, it would become Harvard University. But in its initial stages, it was a Bible college. What? For individuals wanting to go into the ministers in the Anglican Church to be trained and taught. But itinerant preachers in terms of Baptists and the Methodists and like this had no official training, no regimented education that they went to. They called upon being called, receiving the Spirit, being chosen by God to deliver his word. And I want you to keep this point in mind, because amongst these individuals, it never goes away. And over time, it becomes more powerful and more powerful and more powerful in terms of this person who he may speak in tongues. And I'm saying he because mostly at the time, it was male individuals who were in aspect of this. They had no permanent home. They traveled from town to town. Okay? But one thing that they did have that we would say was a gift for gab. They could inspire people. They could scare people out of their wits, talking about, the devastation that God was going to visit upon a stiff-necked and unruly people. And over time, they become very strong. So I'm going to skip over a couple of centuries and get up to the 19th century. By the time the 19th century comes, in the southern United States, in what becomes the Confederate States, the aspect about slavery and religion have been intertwined. Some of the writings that I've read from itinerant ministers at the time were at the time was that if a person was talking about, a white person was talking about the fact that slavery was a terrible institution and slaves should be treated and should be freed, they not only were only seen politically as being out of whack, but religiously as well. Slaves were slaves because this is what God intended. And even though they don't talk about it in terms of the racehorse theory, you have the basis of eugenics that come into play. White people are, by the very nature of the way God created them, superior to any other race on the planet, especially people from Africa. Especially people from Africa. So the two become intertwined. Going to come a little bit further and look again at this aspect of the evangelicals. The Depression was a horrendous circumstance for Americans, no matter what your color was. No ifs and buts about it. But prior to the Depression, you had the Progressive Era. And while a lot of historians look at the Progressive Era and say it was a time of great change, positive change in America, it was one of the most violent periods in America's history, the Progressive Era. A lot of the modern circumstances that we look at and understand and deal with now come about during the Progressive Era. So for example, and not to get away from what we're talking about, but for example, at one point in time in America's history, Chicago, not Kansas City, okay, or anywhere else in the West, Chicago was the leading meat producer in America. Cattle herds coming out of what was called the West, the ultimate arrival was in Chicago at the meat packing process plants that were there. And of course, there was no government oversight. So you had a young man by the name of Sinclair Lewis. He, what we would call by today's terms, embedded himself working in the meatpacking plants of Chicago. And he wrote a book, the only book that he wrote during his time as an author, called The Jungle. And The Jungle was about what he observed taking place in the meatpacking industry in terms of cows and what was happening to them and so forth and so on. And he's at the forefront of what becomes modern journalism. And so he talks about the thing, he just simply narrates about the things that he saw and experienced while working in the meatpacking industry in Chicago. everything from cows with tuberculosis and other diseases being processed and sold to people, individuals, rats being ground up in the what would become sausage and things of this nature. Sometimes individuals, because there was no safety, no OSHA, individuals would lose their fingers, and the process didn't start. They were ground up as well. So he talked about the horrendous aspect of the industry, and he was part and parcel of a new circumstance that was taking place. By the same token, many of you have heard of what were called the robber barons. And these individuals have a double-sided coin to them. Some of them were seen as philanthropists, and some of them were seen as crooks. Business was, if you can't stand the heat, don't get in the kitchen, because government wasn't regulating business. Business was expected to regulate itself. In terms of politics, we begin to see the first emergence of political parties, not Republican and Democrat, but at the local level. Party politics, machine politics, the most famous being out of New York, Tammany Hall. Tammany Hall wasn't a person. Tammany Hall was actually a building that housed an athletic club. But the individuals who were there under Boss Tweed were politicians. And so they looked at themselves. This was their profession as politicians. And some of the graft that we understand now started to take place there. There's an individual who, one of the books I use in the class, he writes a book about Tammany Hall. And he writes about a guy by the name of George Plunkett of Tammany Hall. Plunkett described himself as a politician. That was his job. So when he found out where the new municipal building in New York was going to be built, he bought the land. And then he sold it back to the city for them to build a municipal building on it. At the same time, he was in league with any number of individuals who would be responsible for hiring the people who were going to build a municipal building. And he called this, what do you think he called it? He gave it a particular name, but it's an oxymoron when you hear what he called it. Because he made a distinction. He called it honest graft. Honest graft. In one sense, he didn't deny that it was graft, but because it wasn't involved in prostitution, policy at the time, because policy's been around for a long time, and things of this nature, that was considered dishonest graft. He was involved in what was considered honest graft, but graft nonetheless. I use movies sometimes when I teach, but one of the ones that shows you exactly what I'm talking about is Gangs of New York. Okay, it has a lot of themes in it that actually took place in New York City at the time, and that are there. So as we come into the 20th century, the economy is booming. America goes into World War I, comes out, but you have the institutionalization of racism in many different ways. And at the bedrock of this is the evangelical belief as Christians. It becomes extremely important that we don't forget this circumstance, not that we would. So when we approach coming into the 1930s and into the 1940s and World War II, we begin to see something. In the southern United States, evangelicalism takes off. And it takes off because of something called charismatic Christianity. Charismatic Christianity. Anybody have an idea what this means? Sister Andrea? Imam Radi?
This is my first time ever fixing turkey wings.
Okay. Charismatic here. There is a phenomenon that takes place in the 30s. One of the phenomenons is radio. Okay? Just as we know it today. And radio gives the ability for individuals to be reached, hundreds of individuals, thousands of individuals to be reached. And so charismatic Christianity refers to the individuals that we might have grown up hearing about who got their start at this time. The most famous of them being Billy Graham, Oral Roberts. And they covered different Christian denominations, not just Baptists or Protestants or, in that sense, but Billy Graham, Oral Roberts. Later on, Jerry Falwell. Okay? Catholics. You have Father Conklin. Later on, you will have Bishop Sheen and these individuals. And so what do I mean by charismatic here? If you've ever seen a film of Billy Graham in a stadium or a place where he's having a quote unquote crusade, as much as we may not like what it is he was professing out there, objectively, he was a brilliant orator. And he could capture people's attention and capture their hearts, selling them on this aspect of evangelical Christianity and what it meant. Oral Roberts was that way in a different way. Father Conklin was there. And what they had to be that allowed them to reach thousands of people was radio. And so I actually watched some of Billy Graham's sermons that he gave at crusades and watched the crowd. It almost reminded me of, Hitler was definitely a bad person, no ifs and buts about it. But one of the things that allowed Hitler to do what he did in Germany was his brilliance as an orator. Even though many of the speeches that he gave were written by Henry Ford, who started the Henry Ford Motor Company, who was definitely anti-Jewish. And he had that ability to capture pictures. I mean, sometimes Graham would preach for 2 hours, 2.5 hours, 3 hours, and people didn't budge. They did not move. And when in a crusade, he would call for, people to come and to be saved and embrace, and take Jesus as their personal savior. The people flocked to him. This happened repeatedly. Oral Roberts was the same way in Oklahoma. As quote unquote country as he seemed, he was a brilliant orator as well. And all of these men gathered people to them that were excellent organizers and putting forth the things that they were talking about and what they were trying to do. And at the same time that comes with that, numbers, and when they begin to ask for money, it comes. But something else comes, and it happens with Billy Graham. Politicians, Republican politicians, not so much Dixiecrats, but Republican politicians began to see the effect that Graham, Falwell, and other individuals like them have on individual citizens, and pretty much come up with the idea, if we can harness this impetus of what has now become known as evangelical Christianity, if we can harvest it with a political message and bring them together, we have a very strong political force and a loyal one. The person that this happens with is Jerry Falwell. Falwell came up with the conceptualization of something called secular humanism.
Secular what?
Humanism. Secular humanism.
Humanism.
Okay? And from Falwell's position, this is the worst thing that was taking place in America. And what he pointed to as the examples of what was taking place with secular humanism was the rate of abortions in America and the beginnings very subtly of homosexuality and lesbianism. And he said the only way that America was going to be saved from destruction was through evangelical Christianity. And he also cautioned his people not to vote for anyone or anybody that was talking about women having the right to abortion, or that homosexuals were good people, should have equality before the law, should not be discriminated against. And there's a third aspect here. Also, don't be talking about the aspect of racial equality. No such thing exists. Period. So in 1968, when Nixon puts forth his Southern strategy, the Southern strategy was to draw as many, quote unquote, Southern Democrats away from the Democratic Party into the Republican Party. This is part of the strategy that's used. The culmination of the marriage between Republicans and evangelicals comes with Reagan. Reagan, in a campaign speech, he says to, and here's another guy, how smart he was, Allah's best to know. But put him in front of a mic, from him having been an actor, and he could rule a crowd. So at a campaign stop in running for president, his first term, everybody in it is an evangelical Christian. And Reagan says to them, I know that you're supposed to be nonpartisan, not involving religion and politics. And that I know that you openly can't support me from that position. He told him, he said, but don't worry, because I support you. And the crowd exploded in terms of that. And so the culmination here, so what we see now, the transition that takes place that allows evangelicals to become more entwined with the Republican Party is TV. Billy Graham again, Jerry Falwell, even Jimmy Swaggart before he got caught messing with prostitutes and stuff. Tammy Faye Baker and her husband Jim Baker before they got caught. Okay? And in that comes some African Americans as well. Now, one of the most noted TV evangelists is a guy by the name of Kenneth Copeland. Kenneth Copeland's top protege was an African-American evangelical by the name of Creflo Dollar. Copeland has constantly talked about that Creflo Dollar was the greatest mentee that he had. With Billy Graham, he passed things on to his son. Jerry Falwell, along with Bob Jones, like from Bob Jones University, established universities like Liberty University, first called Liberty College, then Liberty University. What was it for? It was to train evangelicals who would follow in his path and keep evangelical Christians allied with the Republican Party by insisting on the fact that they could not depend upon the Democratic Party to be involved in the issues that were most concerning to them. And now definitely it's two: abortion and gay rights. Okay? In the early 20th century, evangelical Christians fought wholeheartedly for women not to have the right to vote. It ultimately takes place, but you don't have it being as a mainstay of the evangelicals fighting for women to have the right to vote. And there's another guy, because the misconception is that this marriage between Republicans and evangelicals came about because of the abortion issue. Not so. There's a guy by the name of Paul Weichert. Most evangelical Christians, ministers, say that it's this guy's ability to draw different aspects together, the evangelical movement with the Republican Party, that ended up with where it is now. Okay? So when people are saying to Biden, don't be wasting your time trying to get Republicans to become Democrats or to vote for you, because in more cases than not going to happen, especially with evangelical Christians. The other most important thing we have to realize here is the white superiority circumstance of evangelical Christianity and its coupling with the Republican Party as it exists now and Donald Trump. People say, how can people look at him who support him, see the nonsense that he says and talks about, and still support him? For evangelical Christians, it's easy because they've been convinced or have convinced themselves when it comes to the issues most important to them, no matter what he does that seems stupid, out of place, the things that he says, as long as he's professing that Roe versus Wade needs to be overturned, not supporting the idea of equality before the law for people of color or sexual orientation and gender, then he's their guy. Bottom line. And the other aspect of it is as well, he's their guy also because of the stance that he has taken in terms of white supremacy. We have to realize that many of the white supremacist groups, even though how they're talked about and seen, are comprised primarily of evangelical Christians. And for them, it's a struggle for what they see as being the soul of America, that should be white, and that it should be Christian, and that it should be the type of Christianity that they espouse. Granted, they took some hard knocks when Jimmy Swaggart was, when he got busted, and Tammy Faye Baker and her husband Jim Baker got busted. But if you want to see something, Swaggart and Baker, they might have missed a beat for a little while, but they're right back doing what they were doing through the aspects of TV. Joel Osteen, who is a young, charismatic TV evangelist, but evangelical, that's the same. He graduated from Liberty University, was tutored by Jerry Falwell. And out of nowhere, he has one of the largest churches in terms of extended membership that anybody has wanted to see. And yet and still, with even with the number of African Americans who attend his church services, he's taken a very, very quiet position about racial equality and what should happen. So this coupling of the Republican Party and evangelicals is one that 45 is hoping will keep him remain in the White House. It remains to be seen. There's some Republicans who are turning their backs on Trump, like one guy I heard today. But he did not describe himself as an evangelical Christian. He just said that he was a lifelong Republican, but in 2016, he didn't like Trump then, and he didn't vote for him, and he's not going to vote for him again. But the statistics that I showed, that amongst people who declare themselves as evangelical Christians across the racial divide, whether being Caucasian, Hispanic, African American, Asian, 90% support Donald Trump because they see him as being the one best to provide them with the satisfaction of having an America with what they believe in, by virtue of what they believe in. And we should be aware of this circumstance, because these individuals, some of the malicious, they openly talk about the fact that in terms of their ideological circumstance, besides the aspect of the race horse theory, when it comes to religion, they're evangelicals. And they're at the point, as one said, he was kept anonymous. He said, if it means fighting for America to be saved from the homosexuals, et cetera, defunding of police forces, for American streets to become safe again, for America to return to being a God-fearing nation, if it means that we have to fight and some of us have to die, then his statement was, so be it.